The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 teachers in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with the Tennessee academic standards. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu. This video is aligned with the following Tennessee academic standards.
All right, so let's shift gears, and we're going to talk some about primary source analysis. So this is key to creating successful projects, is having our students understand how to analyze primary sources and how to build in historical thinking skills within that, because when we get to looking at the judging sheet later on, you'll see that there are some categories on there that they get points in that essentially talks about different historical thinking skills, so building context and finding different perspectives and balanced research and all that kind of stuff. That's essentially historical thinking. So when we think about analyzing primary sources, we want to think about, first off, what are our goals, right? What are we hoping to have our students be able to accomplish? And we want them, of course, to first off be able to understand the scope of history, right? We want them to understand how complex history is. And they can place that source within that context and kind of see that that source is telling them about the past. We want them to think about the skills that they're going to learn. We want them to think about higher order thinking skills and critical thinking skills. And understanding that when they're analyzing those sources, that they are using those types of skills in order to do that. When we think about primary source analysis, it essentially builds off of the inquiry cycle. And this is the methodology that the Library of Congress has built the TPS program around. And so when we think about primary source analysis, it gets into those first two steps in that cycle, which are connect and wonder, where we're asking students to make observations, where we are having them to think about what they know and to draw connections to their past knowledge, and when we're asking them then to develop questions, and then to make predictions that they are going to then try to flesh out and verify. So as they have analyzed that primary source in Connect and Wonder, then they really start the research process, right? This is where they're going to look to find sources that are going to help answer the questions that they have developed. So they're going to have to build in other primary sources, other secondary sources to answer those questions. They're going to have to make sense of those sources, and then they're going to have to construct new knowledge. So they're going to have to basically figure out, how do these sources answer my question? What do I now understand about the original source? When we get to express, they're going to have to share those findings. So whether that be communication skills, writing skills, text skills, whatever it is, however it is that they're expressing that, they're going to have to work in a different skill set to share what they have figured out on their responses to those original questions. And then finally, they're going to have to reflect, right? They're going to have to think about, why does this all matter? What new questions do I have? What conclusions have I drawn? So that when we think about, again, research, it really is the inquiry cycle. And that when we're using primary sources, oftentimes we can hit on some aspect or multiple aspects of the inquiry cycle within our lessons. And this really drives home kind of that student-centered learning. Which we know that that's something that a lot of us are trying to achieve now, and a lot of districts are pushing us towards, is having learning be more student-centered rather than just the teacher delivering the content, but the student driving the learning. And this kind of process will get at those goals. So with primary source analysis, if you guys have been to some of our workshops before, you're probably really familiar with this worksheet. This is the primary source analysis tool that the Library of Congress has developed. So when we devise activities, this is really the foundational piece that we use in those activities, because it is a really great way to get kids started in thinking about analyzing a source. And so you'll note on that sheet that there is observe, reflect, and question. Well, we like to simplify that. So instead of saying we want you to observe the source, we like to simplify that for kids because they're going to look at me and be like, you want me to what? So what do you see? So when you look at a source, what do you see? And then when we get into reflect, instead of asking kids to reflect on a source, what do you know? And then for question, what do you wonder? What do you want to know about the source? So we're going to look at this image right here. So let's think about those three questions. First off, what do we see?
Angry faces.
Okay.
First thing I looked at was the date,
Okay.
1867, so it's during Reconstruction.
All right, remember just what we see right now.
Oh, just what
Yeah.
I see, okay.
So we see a date, right? We see March 16th, 1867. Someone mentioned terrible hairstyles.
Yes.
We got a black man voting in a voting line.
All right, we see a black man who is there voting.
Angry face.
Angry faces,
There's a sign that just says the white man's ticket.
right? We see the sign there, it says the white man's ticket, and underneath it, it says for Mayor H. Addison.
What does that say that he's holding? The guy with the top hat, he's holding like a...
All right, so the guy in the top hat we see is holding looks like a rolled up parchment, and it says suffrage vote.
Veto, suffrage veto.
Oh, sorry, suffrage veto, you're right. And then it says District of Columbia.
And are we looking at those two together?
Yes.
As one? So the woman at the bottom appears to be at home.
Okay.
There's no women in line.
They're not in line.
Yeah, so there's no women at the top but we see women at the bottom, and the one in the center here is kind of looks like in a home environment.
All the hairstyles are different in the bottom.
Yeah, with the different hairstyles at the bottom. And while these images are on the same page, they're also, they're sort of, they're different, but they're juxtaposed together, right?
We have a man that looks like Lincoln behind the black man, if that's significant.
All right. There's actually, so that you have the tall guy here that kind of reminds me of a Lincoln-esque figure, the top hat, and he's tall. You also have, in one of our groups last week, pointed out this one, the guy over here also looks almost like a ghostly figure of Lincoln. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but.
Super amazing posture, the guy in the center.
Yes. Yes.
The guy behind him has something written on his hat. I can't decide if it's USA or CSA.
Yes, the guy behind him on his hat, it says ex-CSA.
Confederate States.
So the guy on the left, Johnson.
Wait, we're still doing observations right now.
He looks like a grumpy old Johnson. Sorry.
The guy behind the African American gentleman that looks almost like he's wearing a military hat.
Yeah, I was thinking that looked more like Grant to me.
Okay. So now let's think about what do we know. So we mentioned Andrew Johnson. What do we know about Andrew Johnson? That might relate to this.
Segregation.
He's from Tennessee. He's president.
He got impeached.
Got impeached.
Found not guilty by one vote.
Okay.
Compromise candidate.
All right.
Served in the U.S. Senate for Tennessee after president.
Right.
The Southern president after.
He was not known to get along with people well.
Okay.
He was very lenient on the South after the Civil War.
Okay.
Yeah, he did not want them to be charged with all the debt of the Civil War.
Right. So this is supposed to be Johnson here, holding his suffrage veto. What else do we know that might help us to understand this page?
What suffrage means.
All right, what does suffrage mean? Yeah.
Right to vote.
All right, right to vote. What do we know that might help us to understand this part of the image?
The woman is still at home. At least the black man is at the place trying to vote.
Right.
I'm not a Tennessean, but I read was one of the last votes to pass the women's vote cast by Tennessee. Yes.
It was,
Yes.
but that's 1920.
So that's way later.
Yes.
So it couldn't have done this.
Yeah.
Is it just me, or does it look like the second guy from the left, is putting money into the pocket of The first guy. Is that money or is
In
that?
the Johnson's pocket.
No, there's actually, it says veto.
It says veto.
Yeah. So his pocket veto.
Excellent.
So what questions do we have? What questions come to mind when looking at this page?
What are they voting for?
Okay.
Why is this on the same page?
All right, why are these two images together?
Why
That's
are they so?
What is up with the hairstyles, right?
Just trying to distract from the real issue by putting fashion in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
People can pay attention.
And he's got his hand over the white man's ballot box. He's not going to let him put his vote into the white man's ballot box. In case you didn't notice that.
Well, being the devil's advocate, I also have to just say, is it just simply circumstantial, or rather, just by chance that the advertisement on the bottom is there? You know, was it intentional, or is it just, that's how the newspaper laid it down, or the magazine?
Okay.
My question is, why is it just the women, it's focusing on the woman being home? Where the men were out doing something, they really focus on the woman being at home in this picture.
Okay. So these are all really good questions. So what we want our students to do, of course, then is to start to figure out what sources do I want to look at to try to begin to answer those questions. Now, before we move on, a couple things about this particular image. Of course, this is a Thomas Nast image, and part of what he is getting at is this discussion that's going on between the women's suffrage advocates who are really upset with the 15th Amendment because they have been left out. And so it is using this image here at the bottom to talk about the women's sphere, right? Essentially being home, worrying more about fashion and hairstyles than it is about what's going on with voting. And so that is what this image is trying to get at, is that controversy at the time between the expansion of the right to vote and the fact that women have been left out of the 15th Amendment.
Now it's interesting because I've seen that image, the top image, in textbooks and documents used in classrooms, but I've never seen the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have this really bad habit of compartmentalizing different points in history, and I think women's suffrage is one that we do that with. We don't think about what was happening with women's suffrage during Reconstruction. I think that we talk about it at the beginning with Seneca Falls, and then we talk about it at the end when the 19th Amendment is being passed, but we don't talk about what was happening in the in-between phases. And this debate that was going on, the fact that women's suffrage advocates had basically stopped a lot of their efforts prior to the Civil War to support the war efforts, and then after the war ends, they feel that that they are going to also be benefit from the expansion of different rights that were going forward and were left out, and that angered them because many of them had also been part of the abolition movement, and so they really felt like they had been betrayed. So going through this process of asking what do we see, what do we know, and what do we wonder helps us to hit on several different skills. And so when we think about what do we see, we're going to have to read closely to determine what is being said explicitly. We're going to have to cite evidence. We're going to have to summarize key supporting details and ideas. When we get to what do we know, we're going to have to make inferences. We're going to have to draw conclusions. We are going to have to determine central ideas and themes. We are also going to have to think about interpreting words and phrases. Or if we're looking at a visual, we're going to have to interpret symbolism and those kind of skill sets. We're going to have to think about word choice and meaning. We're going to have to analyze text structure. We're going to have to think about point of view and purpose. And then when we get to what do we know and into further investigation, we are going to have to think about analyzing how and why things interact over the course of a text. When we bring in the additional source material to answer those questions in further investigation, we are going to have to integrate and evaluate content from multiple sources, and most likely from diverse formats of sources. We are also going to have to evaluate arguments and claims, and we're going to have to analyze how multiple sources address a similar topic or theme. So that, again, in this process of really asking three simple questions of a source and trying to answer some of those questions that we develop, we are going to be building in 15 different skills that appear within our language arts curriculum. And also, of course, evident within our social studies curriculum too, but this is a great way to think about how the two subjects can be bridged with primary source analysis. How many of you guys use a similar method with your students? All right, how do your students respond?
I think that because this is more inquisitive and kind of supports more of a detective type approach, I think that students get deeper and they also stay more interested. Whereas if you just give them like a document or a picture and then give them some basic level questions, then they're really just skimming for the answers. They're not actually, trying to get anything out of it. So this, I like this way a little bit better.
What I've found is that when you put the image up there, at first they're always looking for the right answer. Oh no, what is the teacher looking for?
Yes.
And so they're very hesitant to say anything. But once I start throwing up a few examples, I see trees, I see grass. Then they understand I'm looking for any answer.
Right.
So what you tend to get is students who are at the lower end of the spectrum or lower end of the skill set, they'll start throwing out stuff and nobody's laughing at them. And so you get a lot more engagement from all levels of the class. Nobody's making fun of anybody else because they don't know what the right answer is, because everything's the right answer.
Right.
And so even those students who are trying to cut up and be the class clown, they're failing at it because anything they say is the right answer. And so then once you get into the interpretation or the reflection of it, they bought into it and they want to find out more. And I mean, we've looked at pictures from World War I and World War II, and they'll see stuff in the picture that I've never seen before. I'm like, holy cow, you're right. I never saw that before. So.
Yeah, and that's something that I really love about this approach, because your students will pick up on things that you might not notice, and that they work off of each other, right? So like one student might notice something or might make one point, and another student's going to build off of that. And so this type of approach, especially if you do it as a class discussion or as group work, gets into building that accountable talk, and so that they are really engaged with each other, building those communication skills in the subject area. The other thing, just like you mentioned, this is a great way to get students engaged across the ability levels, because when we think about observations, that's a question that all of our students are going to be able to contribute to. And then we think about background knowledge. This is going to be really important because it's going to help you to figure out where are the holes in your students' background knowledge. Do they have some misconceptions that they're coming in with? Especially we think about, most people in the American public get the majority of their historical information from popular culture. And we all know that, movies and TV shows and, whatever, a lot of times change things for entertainment value. So if your students have only ever watched Disney's version of Pocahontas, they think that's what happened. You could throw up some primary source images and, you start talking about it and you're going to realize that this is what they think has happened. And so that can help you to, again, learn how to think about how to address those misconceptions that are out there.
After teaching English this is my 23rd year of teaching, but after teaching English all these years and moving into a new subject area, I appreciate this so much because these are our standards, 6th grade ELA, and the connection between those and using the words that they're already familiar with in ELA is going to be very beneficial. It makes me feel more at home to see the verbiage that's up on the board right now.
Well, and the other thing that can be helpful, because for a lot of schools, the challenge, especially in elementary and middle school, instructional time for social studies oftentimes gets cut, right? You don't get as much as you need, especially when you get into those middle school standards and you see the number of social standards you have to cover. If you can figure out ways to bridge English and social studies, it's a way to get a little more instructional time to help you be able to cover the volume of standards that you have to cover. And of course, the more students are able, the longer they're able to work with a particular source, the more familiarity they're going to build, the way they're going to be able to master that source. So if it's something that they're going to see later on at the end of the year on the social studies test, that is going to help them because they've spent all that additional time with that source. They're going to be comfortable with it. They're going to be able to answer those questions in a proficient manner. So again, that's where if you can work with your, if you get to teach both, or if you can, partner and work with your English teacher or work with your social studies teacher, it really is beneficial for your kids. So that's one way, kind of a basic way to approach analysis. If we want to take that a step further, and we want to think about starting to build historical thinking skills, So maybe we're working with high school students, or we've got middle schoolers that we want to start to challenge that next step. We want to think about analyzing so that we're thinking about chronological thinking, we're thinking about comprehension, we're thinking about analysis interpretation, we're building research capabilities, and that we're doing issue analysis and decision making. And so this type of analysis is going to be more challenging. It's going to kind of get at a deeper level of inquiry. We're going to ask more challenging questions. We're going to have to know more background knowledge. The way we like to break this down is looking at it from these 5 viewpoints. So thinking about historical context, intended audience, point of view, purpose, and outside information. All right, so we're going to go through and talk about each of these 5 kind of categories. And then I'm going to have you guys actually analyze a couple sources thinking about these. So we'll go through them individually first. So thinking about historical context to begin with. So what we want students to be able to do, of course, is to connect the document or the source to the moment in time in which it was created. We want them essentially to be able to think about when they look at that document, they've identified when and where it was created, and if U.S. history or whatever history you're teaching is a timeline on the wall, you could plop it down on that timeline and they would describe all the things that were happening around it. So that in doing that, they can understand its place amongst all of the different things that were happening when it was created and how it connects to those. So like when we think about that image we looked at earlier, we want to think about connecting it essentially to the larger fight for women's suffrage, but also then connecting it to what was happening with Reconstruction. So knowing like those 2 incidents and connecting it to the context for both of those events. When we think about intended audience, we want to think about who the source was created for. And if we can identify who that source was created for, having us then think about how that helps us to understand what's being said. Does that influence the tone? Does that influence the content of what is there? So again, if we think about that Harper's Weekly image, who was typically the readership for Harper's Weekly?
Educated.
All right, educated?
DC area.
Yeah, it's more of a Northeast publication. I mean, it's circulated nationwide, but it's published out of the Northeast. So knowing those 2 things, how does that help us to understand that image a little bit? Okay, so think about it this way. So imagine, right, they're going to fit to who's going to read it. So imagine had that publication been printed in the South as opposed to being printed in the Northeast. How might that have changed what they had to say about Johnson, for example?
A smile on his face.
Right.
A bit more handsome.
All right, so, right, because the South is probably going to have a different perspective on Johnson, and they're going to try to speak to whatever that perspective is. So knowing that audience is going to help us to kind of understand the tone for the image. Another example I like to use, there's a memoir that we've used before. The title for it is Humorous Incidents in the Life of the Civil War. And the guy starts his talk and starts the memoir with that he is doing this by invitation of the Daughters of the Confederacy, and he is a Confederate veteran. So understanding that he is speaking to this group of women 15, 20 years after the war, knowing that first off they have a shared political viewpoint, right? And that he's speaking to a group of women in the late 1800s. So I know that he's probably not going to talk about the graphic detail of war, because he wouldn't have shared that with a group of women. And I know that they're probably going to be sympathetic to the same political causes, because they're from the same side. So again, understanding that, and you could pose different scenarios to your kids. So think about if he was speaking to a group of other veterans, or if he was speaking to a mixed group of Union and Confederate veterans. How might what he's talking about change? You could also pose it to your kids. Imagine that you're telling a story to your best friend versus your parents, versus a stranger, versus your teacher. Like, how is that your audience changing what it is that you're saying, even though maybe you're talking about the same event? So point of view. So once we've identified the audience, we want to think about the point of view of the author. So we want to think about what their relationship to the event in question is. We want to think about what is their understanding of that event, and then how reliable are they? Now, reliability can be difficult to assess. And one way to get at that, of course, is having your students to think about what biographical data can we determine about the person who created the source. So can we figure out their gender, their age, their ethnicity, their social status? And understanding that the more we can fill in these different types of categories is going to help us to determine to some extent their reliability based on whatever it is they're talking about. So, and understanding also within this, like we probably are never going to be able to 100% determine, you know, are they 100% accurate just looking at one source. But it is going to help us to start to be able to judge that. One that I like to think about, so if you have done the early American history, you've looked at some of John Smith writing. John Smith wrote about his time during the time he was supposedly rescued by Pocahontas 2 different times at different periods. And depending on which publication you're reading, he talks about the event in very different ways. So in the first account, he never even mentions Pocahontas. Mentions nothing about having his life threatened, nothing about being rescued. The second time around, he's writing just after she's died. And then she appears, and she appears in the story, and he talks more about kind of her coming in and saving him and saving his life. So obviously he was there. He is a primary source, but he has contradicted himself. So we know his reliability, to some extent, is in question. So again, we're never really going to know 100% about reliability, but we can start to think about it based on some of these different scenarios and building in, of course, the point of view, but then thinking about context and audience also. Purpose. We want to think about why a source was created. Were we trying to persuade? Are we trying to inform? Why was the author creating the source? What did he hope to get across, he or she hoped to get across to their audience? And then finally, we want to think about what additional historical information can we get from the document. Does this bring up other points beyond kind of the key focus that's going on? Does this relate to other documents, other points in time, maybe other things that we want to look at? How does this help us to make our argument? Okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to pair you guys up. You've got an image. You're also going to get an excerpt from the preface of an accounting of the proceedings of the trial of Susan B. Anthony. So what I want you guys to do in your groups is I want you to go through and I want you to analyze these 2 sources, again, with those 5 categories for historical thinking in mind. So thinking about the context, the audience for each one, point of view, purpose, and outside information. So I want you to discuss those, and then I want you to think about how these 2 sources could work together.
Yeah, pretty much.
Just told them what it was.
Yeah, well, the proof.
Some are for it, some against it.
It actually coincides. There is all male. It's all male white.
They did a good job. This is just an account of what took place.
Published by the court without any express assent or dissent.
Now, something you can do with your students, especially if you have some way to get this funded, is have little magnifying glasses in your classroom that they can really get into that because they really get to play the detective then. And that can also help when you're looking at something where there's like very minute detail and you're trying to figure out words or an image can be helpful. So think about it. Use little magnifying glasses. Let's talk about these 2 sources. So what is the context?
Well, it's the election in 1872, so it's before Seneca Falls and everything else. So.
Well, Seneca Falls was
1848.
Oh,
yeah.
I was thinking 1891.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was off.
That's where it all started.
Yeah.
Actually, it all started with the election of Andrew Jackson. He got the people moved and got the women moved, actually. So.
Well, actually, you could even date it back further. You could actually go to Abigail Adams, but
Well, you could even go to the Cherokee Nation.
We could just keep going back. All right, so what else is going on in the 1870s? All right, so we're still in the midst of kind of reconstruction, getting closer to midpoint to the end of reconstruction, depending on where you're at.
So it's up north in New York.
Okay. All right, so yeah, both of these sources are northeastern New York. Audience. Who's the audience for these two?
It's going to be for ladies.
All right. You think the Daily Graphic is maybe for women?
If it's going to upset the jurors if it was for, men are going to get upset with this because here he's got the baby's not happy. He's got the groceries for dinner. Got a female police officer here, and women have taken over the rest of the stage.
All right, so if the Daily Graphic is for men, largely a men viewership, they may be a little upset with all of the changing audience.
Like I said, okay, it depends on if they meant it to be serious. If they meant it to be serious, then they're saying, women, look at women can do. Women can become police officers. Women can vote. Women can become citizens. But if they meant it to be sarcastic, they're saying, look, women would end up as police officers and men would be stuck with babies.
Okay, so
I looked at the paper a little
Okay,
bit,
that's
and
what I
it
was
says
thinking.
that it was a tabloid evening newspaper and often printed controversial stories. It was known for printing the first halftime photograph.
That was hidden.
Often scandalous stories.
all right.
Sarcastic. So that suggestion of switching the roles.
Okay. So they are trying to elicit a response, right? Trying to stir up a controversy here and showing, look at what these women who dare are trying to do. They're trying to upend our society. And so that's, trying to speak to that audience who probably maybe likes to be stirred up, likes to argue about things.
Was it more of a women's newspaper?
It didn't say that.
It's going to stir every which one.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to make women think. It's going to upset men and make them think. So it's not really whether it's sarcastic or serious. Either way, it's going to serve its purpose.
Okay. What about the other one? What do we think the audience for the trial proceedings is?
I still think it's
are on trial, right? It was written by the men for their point of view, really.
I still think it's aimed toward women or women's suffragist favors because the very last paragraph's all I keep going back to where it says the court entered the verdict without any input from the jury. So in other words, we want to make sure she's the only one that's brought to court. And so it's very much so to me, even though it is what happened in court, it's showing that we didn't get to hear what the jury thought about the evidence, and we're going to make sure and we're going to give a fine, and that's it.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think that for the most part, the whole article, the article deals with facts, but when you get to that last paragraph, you notice a change in tone of some of the language used. But even then, you could almost say, well, they're still just reporting factually what happened because the language is almost neutral.
Right.
You know? Just a touch in favor of the defendants.
Yeah. Okay. And the other thing that you might note here, and if you really kind of did a little more digging, of course, it's printed in Rochester. If you did a lot of looking, you know Seneca Falls isn't real far from there. So this is kind of the heart of the women's abolitionist movement is in that area of New York. So that might also make you think that it's...
The title of the picture, The Woman Who Dared, that's not a we're going to shy away from it type title. I mean, I told you, Elizabeth Warren is the first person I thought of, so...
Not only that, but they made her look so strong. I mean, she, perspective, the fact that she's closer to the front made her look taller.
Red, white, and blue.
Yep, the red, white, and blue hat.
The masculine pose.
Exactly.
Yeah, if we think about that, though, from the context of what was defined to be the ideal for women during the 1870s. So when we look at it today, we think about, that it's popular to exhibit kind of strong attributes in women, right? At that point in time, though, like the more feminine, they were home sphere to be taken care of. Yes. And so if you have students think about it, in relation to what was expected of women during the time period and how that fit into the gender norms, societal and cultural norms of the time, might change their perspective on how she's being presented. And that's, again, helping to kind of take them out of our modern day values and the way we look at things and think about how was it viewed at that point in time.
There's also a female police officer. Would have boggled their mind. Would have seemed ridiculous to them, right? Like they just wouldn't have imagined that would have been a possibility. Point of view. So we've kind of sort of touched on point of view with these. I was just curious looking at the election because I knew it was Grant running for a second term. There was no Democrat that ran against him. It was all Republicans, and more liberal Republicans versus Republicans. And the only candidate from New York was the guy who ran against him that had 43% of the vote. I wonder who she voted for, like which.
Me too.
I'm like, don't really understand who. I mean, it probably wasn't Grant, but you never know, couldn't it?
Well, but that makes it more to the point to me. It doesn't matter. We deserve the right to vote. It doesn't matter who's running because it doesn't, the Democrat, that's more up today, but it was where the women's suffrage movement started, more or less. And so they just deserve the right to vote in their eyes. And so I think that's the...
But it makes you wonder if she supported a candidate publicly or not, to investigate further, or if she just supported the right to vote.
So that would be something to look like. Were they trying to be politically active, or were they just advocating? Yeah.
It didn't matter who they voted for, just as
Yeah, so that would be something good to explore further to see kind of, was the abolitionist movement trying to, to court one party over another. Okay, so purpose. What do you think the purpose for these two items are?
Stir people up.
All right.
Definitely the cartoon was to get a response.
All right, so we're going to stir up some controversy, get people talking.
Well, they're slanted views. I mean, they're to get people to begin to think about what women voting could do.
Outside information. What you guys think about that one? Outside information related to these two.
Just that it was almost 50 years before they finally did get the right to vote.
Yeah, so kind of looking at the, it's 50 more years. They'd been 30-ish years from the beginning of the kind of concentrated movement. 50 more years before they're actually accomplished that goal. What else?
We talked about Susan B. Anthony herself, because you look at her and you almost kind of wonder if they were making fun of the way, like her look, she looks so stern. But then if you look at the other pictures of her, it's not really making fun of her. It's just she always has this, she's always kind of stern looking. Okay. And the kids would think, well, if they look at it, maybe they're making fun of the way she looks if they don't see other pictures of her.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe look at other ways that she's, her other images of her.
Yes.
Makes me think if more women were able to vote in this election, how would it turn out? Millions more votes versus the 7-8 million votes they probably have. So,
anybody else?
We said Susan B. Anthony was a leader in the women's suffrage movement. She wasn't just some, because she's the only one that got charged, and there was 14 other women, so obviously she had a reputation.
Okay.
Let me ask this, because along the lines of what you were just saying, was it that, or was it that the other ones just decided to settle out of court? Was it that type of mentality?
No, part of it would have been to make an example of her, because of course she was the leader. And so anytime you typically have a movement and you have people pushing forward, they try to make an example out of the leaders because people know their names.
I looked up the Latin term there. I wondered that too, and it said drop charges, didn't it?
Yeah.
And you wondered why.
Yeah.
That's probably why.
That's like a lot of movements. The person out front, Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
I mean,
he was going to get charged. Yeah.
So the people out front, they're out there at a sacrifice. I mean, they're willing to get their head chopped off for what happened.
Yeah.
Mother Jones, who was a former teacher who fought for the coal miners and things of unions for years, and she's buried with coal miners because of the way the companies mistreated their employees and things. So the leaders are always willing to be sacrificed.
Yeah, and typically, the powers that be there trying to stop those movements will want to make an example of those. So that would be the reason that I would think that she was the one that was singled out
I
there.
just wondered if it was that, or if it was based on the Latin, definition. Was it that, or was it that she just separated, not separated?
Yeah, you probably could dig more into this book, and there's probably more detailed information about that. But yeah.
They dropped charges against one of the jurors, against one of the election board,
Yeah.
because they voted to not take their votes, so they didn't charge them either, just charged the two.
Yeah.
So it's very much, we're making a point.
Yeah. The other thing for outside information that I would want to look at is the 14th Amendment. Of course, it mentions that within the preface excerpt that you read, that they were trying to build her case using the 14th Amendment, and so you would want to look maybe a little further at that and think about how that they were relating it to this push to gain them the right to vote. So in thinking about this process for analysis versus the earlier process that we used, how do you see these two compare? Like, how would you compare these two? As far as difficulty levels, the types of questions that you're asking, the different types of skills that you're having to use?
The first one is a little bit more surface. This evokes definitely depth.
Less intimidating, I guess.
Yeah.
Don't dig deep.
Yeah, actually, the first one would be, I would think, easier done by an individual. This one requires much more bounce back, much more discussion, feeding off each other.
So I think you guys can see two different ways to approach analysis, and they can work well together, but I do think you're right. The second is definitely more in depth, works well, especially if you're working with middle school students, or even if you're just introducing this to the high school level. You probably want to have the kids work in groups, small groups, or pairs, and it's going to require them a little more time. You're going to have to do more digging. You're going to have to know more background knowledge. You're going to have to look for some additional source material to get at some of those questions. But trying to analyze sources with these types of historical thinking in mind really can enrich their learning. You start to dig deeper into these, you can start to unpeel just how much content we can learn from a primary source. So if this is something that you want to look for some additional resources around, we have done 3 different newsletters on historical thinking that you can find on our website. We've been doing them, they've been in the December or January issue for each of the last 3 years. We also have a lesson plan called Immigration, a Case Study in Multiple Perspectives and Diverse Formats that pulls in several different sources looking at immigration in the early 20th century, examines them from multiple perspectives, and then also examines them thinking about when you analyze these different types of sources, what different types of information can we learn from them? How do they work well together, and kind of comparing these different types of formats. I would also say that if you are interested in learning more about this, I would invite you to check out the Stanford History Education Group. They have a wonderful website that you can set up a free account on. They have lots of lesson plans and other resources that are there that will get at this. They also have a website they have done called Beyond the Bubble. They are one of our TPS partners, and that is something that they have done as part of their TPS work, Beyond the Bubble. And they are short assessment pieces, again, getting at historical thinking skills. You'll work with one primary source, and the students are giving one prompt. So thinking about sourcing or contextualizing or corroborating evidence. And so it will, again, help you to assess kind of where your students are at with these different skill types. And then, again, if you want to do a little more digging, I will recommend there's one other book that I've enjoyed. Dr. Yorkie Williams has done a book, Teaching U.S. History Beyond the Textbook. Again, his name is Dr. Yorkie Williams, Teaching U.S. History Beyond the Textbook. And that one is another good one for thinking about different ways to analyze sources to build in historical thinking.